Hey, what's up, psychos? Welcome to another episode of Take Your Pills, Psychopath, the comedy podcast that exploits mental illness for personal profit. What? Trademark. I am your host, John F. O'Donnell, J-Fod. How are we doing out there, everybody? How has everybody's mental health been lately? Are we staying on top of it? Are we slipping? How we doing? It's the summer, man. It's the summer. I hope everybody's having a glorious summer. I hope everybody's feeling well. I hope everybody is figuring out how to beat the heat. If you're in a place that's real hot, like I am here in New York, it has been brutal. Like last week was pretty brutal. It's going to be brutal later this week too. But, we'll do what we got to do. We'll do what we got to do. Excuse me. Trying to figure out what I want to talk about with y'all this week. I got a great show lined up, great interesting pieces. I've scoured the interwebs, looked at a whole bunch of different psychology, psychiatry sites, all sorts of places to pare it down, to find some of the articles and pieces that I think are the most interesting that we're going to go over in yet another J-Fod solo episode of the podcast. Because in the summer, guys, it's a little bit hard to find guests. People are out of town, man. People are doing their thing all over the place. So I've been doing some solo episodes. That being said, I have some great interviews lined up for next week. So I'm psyched about that. We're doing another solo episode this week, which is fine. I think people have been enjoying these solo episodes. The response has been really positive to it. So let me know what you think about them. Email me at takeyourpillspod@gmail.com. Let me know what you think about these solo episodes. Let me know any positive feedback, any critiques you have of the podcast. I'd love to hear from you and connect with you. If you got some extra cash, definitely sign up for my Patreon at patreon.com/JFOD, patreon.com/JFOD. You get a bonus episode every week, plus other special content and things like that, like an AMA, Ask Me Anything, monthly, and you can even get a personalized video chat with me at a certain tier. So definitely do that. It really is a great way to help me out and help out the show. That's patreon.com/JFOD. Do it, folks. Get behind that paywall. Also, make sure you join my newsletter at jfodnews.com. It's a great way to be reminded about the podcast and other things that are going on with me. So that's the deal. Let's get into the pieces this week. Let's do an overview real quick of what we're going to read. The first thing is going to be, it's going to be kind of a shorter piece, but super interesting and worthwhile. It's called "This is What It's Like to Suffer from Bipolar Depression from the Inside," and I think this is a great description of how bipolar depression feels. And I feel like I have not talked enough about bipolar depression. I've talked a ton personally and in my act about bipolar mania. But the depression thing, because it's so lonely and it's so just sad and dark and depressing, obviously, that it's hard to talk about. So I think that this person does a great job of that. So we're going to read that to start. But also we're going to cover, just so you guys got an overview of everything we're going to go over, the best way to control unwanted thoughts. That is worthwhile to learn about that. Then we're going to go over how evolutionary psychology explains human behavior. Interesting. Then new research uncovers why we all see the world so differently. Worthwhile to know about. Next, is it finally time to eliminate the borderline diagnosis? Fascinating. And then finally, we've got laughter with friends differs from laughter with romantic partners, study finds. So, I'm a comedian. I'm interested in what evokes laughter. I'm interested in different types of laughter. So I thought we would read about that and explore that. Why not? All right. So this first piece, let's get to it. This is from psychreg.org is the name of the publication. This piece is by Deb Wilk, and it's called, once again, "This is What It's Like to Suffer from Bipolar Depression from the Inside." Excuse me. She says, here we go. "It's odd that I haven't spent much time talking about bipolar depression when I've spent so much time being depressed. I've discussed mania far more often, similar to what I was saying, you guys, even though I haven't experienced it as frequently because, well, it's more chaotic and makes more of an impression on my mind and in my life. Okay. In its own way, however, bipolar depression is far more devastating. It's like a black tar that seeps into every crevice of my mind. It affects my body in a similar fashion. Everything, mind and body, moves in slow motion because it is weighed down by that sticky, heavy substance that has invaded life and limb. I am better at predicting an episode of mania before it happens than I am at predicting a depressive episode. Perhaps that's because depression is quieter and more insidious in its approach. Its differentiation from a normal state isn't quite as steep in the beginning as is that of mania. At least in my case, that's the only way I can describe it. It's easier for me to fall down than it is to fall up. Interesting. This is important to hear, I think. It's resonating with me. It certainly is. Symptoms of bipolar depression. Symptoms of bipolar depression include the following: loss of interest or pleasure in most or all normal activities, a generally depressed mood, fatigue, loss of energy, insomnia or sleeping too much, irritability, lethargy, restlessness, inability to think clearly, lack of concentration and focus, weight gain or loss often attached to appetite, feelings of extreme guilt, worthlessness or lack of self-esteem, melancholy, suicidal thoughts, ideation, and or attempts. At least 5 of these symptoms must be present for this to be considered a depressive episode. An episode can last anywhere from a few days to a few months. The crash of a depressive episode can sometimes be precipitated by a manic or hypomanic episode. That's how it works for me, guys. It is all the more debilitating for having followed a high. Depression symptoms can interfere with a person's daily life and activities. They can disrupt one's relationships, family, and social life. They can wreak havoc on one's day-to-day existence. Very true. A glimpse inside my own depression. Unfortunately, I am not very good at predicting the onset of a depressive episode. I often find myself there before I know what's happening. When it hits like a ton of bricks, inside my mind and inside my body as well. The physical and mental dread is enormous. Where with mania, there are bursts of color, with depression, there is a black void. It's painful to feel and it's painful to watch, because by this point, I become an observer in my own life. Yes, this is really resonating with me, guys, in my depressions, because you become an observer in your own life. It's as though you're a husk of your former self. It's as though you're a rumor of how dynamic you used to be. At least that's how I feel. And you're just sort of watching yourself unfold as this sad, slow-minded, just broken version of you. It's the fear of what I know is coming. My first thought is always that I fervently wish this was a manic, not a depressive episode. As dangerous as they are far more pleasant than the black cloud that hangs over my head when I'm depressed. Don't misinterpret my words, however. Neither type of episode is good, and both are debilitating and dangerous. My first indication that I am in trouble is when I cannot get dressed, get out of bed, or get off the couch. This can literally happen in the space of a day. As each hour chimes by on my mantle clock, I tell myself that I will get up at the next half hour's chime. Before I know it, the entire day is gone. I have done nothing, nor have I gotten dressed. I have simply dozed on and off all day and can't wait to go to bed as soon as I possibly can. And so the days go on until I get the depression under control. Depression and others. As a final note, bipolar depression doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone around you, everyone who is going through it with you. But there's nothing quite as bad or as tormenting as living inside your own mind when you are going through a bipolar depressive episode. You are, in the end, alone in what feels like a very solitary universe, in what is a very solitary universe. It is an eerie world that exists within your own brain. Well put. Deb Wilkes, well put. Deb Wilkes writes for various publications, and she runs her own blog, Living Bipolar. Great description of bipolar depression. Obviously overlaps with unipolar depression. My clinical depressive episodes have all followed manic episodes, a what goes up must come down situation. And I find that it's harder to express the depressions than it is the manias, because the manias are so vibrant and lively and, to be honest, fucking bonkers and insane, that they do stick in the mind. The depressions are just lonely and isolating and equally debilitating, I think. For a long time, people were saying that, or the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual on Mental Health, Mental Illness, was saying that bipolar 1 disorder, the kind that I have, is more extreme than bipolar 2 disorder, because bipolar 1 has more of the manias followed by the depressions. Bipolar 2 is more depressions followed by hypomania, which is mania light. But that thinking has been reconsidered by the DSM because of how debilitating the depressions can be in bipolar 2 disorder. So there you go. That's the modern conventional thinking. So yeah, interesting piece. Definitely interesting piece. All right, let's move on, you guys. This next piece is in Psychology Today. Psychology Today, always poking its head out in these segments that I do, because they write some good articles. They do some good pieces. This is called "The Best Way to Control Unwanted Thoughts. Thought preemption is a proactive, not reactive, way to control unwanted thoughts." All right. And this is by Christopher Berglund. Some key points. Reactive cognitive control often makes unwanted thoughts peskier and keeps them top of mind in the thought loop. Okay, yes, that certainly happens. Next, deliberately trying to suppress an unwanted thought, quote, "don't think of a white bear," end quote, tends to keep it top of mind. Next, proactive cognitive control can preemptively keep unwanted thoughts at bay and stop repetitive thought looping. Here we go. Quote, "Try to pose for yourself this task, not to think of a polar bear, and you will see that cursed thing will come to mind every minute." That's Dostoevsky in Winter's Notes of Summer Impressions, 1863. Controlling unwanted thoughts is tricky, as, quote, "white bear" or, quote, "pink elephant" thought experiments remind us. When people are explicitly told not to think about pink elephants or white polar bears, they're much more likely to think about these animals. Hence, the so-called white bear problem represents how deliberately attempting to suppress unwanted or intrusive thoughts actually makes them more likely to stay top of mind. In the 1980s, David Wegner led a series of 5-minute experiments in which participants were instructed not to think of a white bear, but to ring a bell if they did. Paradoxically, the harder people tried not to think of a white bear, the more often they had to ring the bell, because white polar bears were all they could think about. Yeah, this recurring thought stuff, I think, is going to be helpful for all of us, because I think a lot of people deal with that. I know that I deal with it, and I've found the thing to do is to focus physically on how I'm feeling when that recurring thought is happening, to realize that the phenomena of it is not unique to me. Maybe the specifics are, but the phenomena of recurring thought is not. And the judgment I put on myself for having the recurring thought is what fuels the fire. So I'm sure some of that is going to be covered here. The paradox of thought suppression. After establishing the paradoxical effects of thought suppression, Wegner developed his, quote, "ironic processes of mental control," end quote, theory in 1994, which describes the phenomena of unwanted thoughts being more likely to stay top of mind when someone tries really hard to suppress them. So what's the best way to overcome the paradoxical white bear problem and control unwanted thoughts? A new study, aptly titled, "If you don't let it in, you don't have to get it out," suggests that proactive thought preemption is the best way to control unwanted thoughts. This paper was published on July 14th in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS Computational Biology. The research question for this study, quote, can we preempt an unwanted thought from coming to mind, similarly to how we can avoid taking an unwanted action? To answer this question, Isaac Fradkin and Iram Eldar recruited 80 English-speaking adults to participate in a free association task during which study participants were instructed to avoid repeating specific word associations after being given verbal cues. Using computational analysis, the researchers compared the effectiveness of reactive cognitive control versus proactive cognitive control and found that the latter is much more effective at controlling unwanted thoughts. Okay, so proactive cognitive control is much more effective than reactive cognitive control. Okay, here we go. The difference between reactive and proactive cognitive control. Reactive cognitive control typically involves rejecting and replacing a thought after it's reached consciousness. In contrast, proactive cognitive control involves keeping an unwanted thought from coming to mind before it takes hold and starts to dominate someone's consciousness as part of a thought loop. How do you do that? Notably, based on the white bear paradox of thought suppression, the catch-22 of preemptive thought control is that if you consciously try to suppress a specific thought, you inevitably have to think about what you're suppressing, which keeps it top of mind. Although it's theoretically possible to preempt unwanted thoughts from entering consciousness, it isn't easy. Most study participants used reactive cognitive control to suppress an unwanted thought after it had reached consciousness. Quote, our findings suggest that thoughts are self-reinforcing. Thinking a thought increases its memory strength and the probability that it will recur, the author explained. In other words, every time we have to reactively reject an unwanted association, it has the potential to become even stronger. Critically, however, we also found that people can partially preempt this process if they want to ensure that this thought comes to mind as little as possible. Although study participants could not avoid unwanted thoughts, they could ensure that thinking an unwanted thought does not increase the probability of it coming to mind again, Fradkin said in a July 2022 PLOS blog about his recent study. All right, mastering the art of proactive cognitive control. Although Fradkin and Elder don't give specific tips for improving one's ability to preemptively keep unwanted thoughts from coming to mind, over the years, I've developed a few tricks for overcoming the paradoxical effects of thought suppression, aka the white bear problem. Okay. As an ultra endurance athlete, I've spent decades trying to control my thoughts during extreme distance events. Just like in daily life, expending mental energy trying to suppress unwanted thoughts during a race is draining and makes it difficult to create frictionless flow states that facilitate peak performance. Based on my lived experience, the key to effective thought preemption is giving it the light touch and not trying too hard to wrestle or strong-arm unwanted thoughts into submission. Based on Wegner's ironic process theory, it's a given that anytime your mind becomes preoccupied with suppressing a particular thought, you're going to think about it more. Therefore, you have to be sly and masterfully outfox yourself using a combination of executive functions and imagination. In a chapter about sports-related mindfulness in The Athlete's Way, I describe a few simple visualizations that can preemptively stop unwanted thoughts from looping. For me, the best way to outsmart intrusive thoughts without overthinking my attempts to suppress them is to visualize wanted, positive thoughts being covered in Velcro and superglue, which makes them stick to my prefrontal cortex. On the flip side, in my mind's eye, unwanted, negative thoughts are Teflon coated and slathered in Vaseline, which makes them very slippery. This visualization makes it harder for unwanted thoughts to stick or take up real estate in the front of my brain. Interesting. When proactively clearing my mind of an unwanted thought, I don't forcibly try to keep it out. Instead, I accept the unwanted thought will always be floating around in my mind and don't waste mental energy trying to stop them from ever intruding. Instead, if an unwanted thought surfaces, I casually nudge it away from being the focus of my attention and think about something else. In an out of sight, out of mind kind of way, I know that if I can prevent my frontal lobes from glomming onto an unwanted thought for a few seconds, it will gradually dissolve into the background of consciousness and slip away. Whenever I notice an unwanted thought percolating on the horizon or hanging out in the periphery of my mind, I relax the backs of my eyes and, without exerting too much rigid mental control, visualize it slipping away. When I feel it dissolving into the background without missing a beat, I quickly refocus my attention on something else and don't give the unwanted thought another millisecond of rumination. Once you've decided not to let an intrusive thought take up too much brain space, if the unwanted thought bubbles up into consciousness, don't get upset or panicky. Instead, I've read that weird. Once you've decided not to let an intrusive thought take up too much brain space, if the unwanted thought bubbles up into consciousness, don't get upset or panicky. Instead, make it slippery and let it go nonchalantly. Cultivating a laissez-faire or que sera, what will be, attitude when unwanted thoughts start to seem intrusive takes away their looping power because you don't dwell on them for long. Take-home message. The more forcibly you try to suppress a thought, the peskier it becomes, and paradoxically, the harder it is to suppress. Preemptive thought control that doesn't succumb to the white bear problem requires some finesse. When practicing proactive cognitive control, keep Wegner's ironic process theory top of mind and don't overthink the thought suppression process. There you go. These are some good tips to control unwanted thoughts. These are some good tips for that for sure. I think that it's practicing cultivating mindfulness. I think what he's getting at here and saying is don't judge yourself for having the recurring thoughts. The judgment, I think, is what fuels the fire of them. And if you're stop fueling the fire, they no longer really have anywhere to go, so they stop coming along as frequently. So I thought that was a really good piece, some really, really good tools to try to replace the negative thought with a positive thought is one thing that he was saying as well. Seems worthwhile. I hope you guys got something out of that. I certainly did. And email me any tools or techniques that you use to try to control unwanted thoughts. takeyourpillspod@gmail.com. Let's keep going. All right, this is going to be interesting. This is from Psych Central. Psych Central. How evolutionary psychology explains human behavior. All right. In the eternal quest to understand human behavior, does evolutionary psychology provide the missing link? Darwin may have approved. Okay. Let's learn about evolutionary psychology, you guys, you psychos. You do the things you do for a multitude of reasons. Your childhood relationships, the challenges you faced, and the chemical processes in your body are among the things that can influence your behaviors. Evolutionary psychology adds ancestral traits to the question. The evolutionary theory says that the habits and cognitive traits that helped your ancestors survive have likely been passed down through the generations until making their way to you. All right. What are the main ideas of evolutionary psychology? The evolutionary perspective in psychology is a purely theoretical approach. It allows for the assumption that many of your core behaviors and ways of processing information are a result of evolution. Okay, so we're in theoretical territory here. Evolutionary psychology is partly based on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. The theory was introduced in his 1859 book On the Origin of Species. In sum, Darwin theorized that within a given population, specific traits are more helpful than others when it comes to the survival of the species. This is referred to as natural selection. Traits that increase the chance of survival are more likely to be genetically passed on to future generations. This creates a process where undesirable traits are more likely to fade over time, while desirable traits can carry on strongly. For example, at some point, foxes with longer legs were able to escape predators more easily. As the shorter-legged foxes fell prey, only the long-legged foxes lived on to reproduce and pass on their genetic characteristics to their offspring. Over time, most or all foxes developed longer legs. Evolutionary psychology applies the premise to human thinking and behavior. Whoa. Evolutionary psychology versus evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology is the process of passing down biological traits. It's the fox with the long legs that escapes its predators. Evolutionary psychology is the natural selection of beneficial cognitive traits passed down through the generations. According to Ellie Borden, a registered psychotherapist from Oakville, Ontario, the two concepts meet when biology factors into psychology and vice versa. As a species improves biologically, for example, it may be more inclined to make new psychological conclusions. Similarly, the more mental tools a species develops, the more likely these may be to influence its biology. Interesting. Principles of evolutionary psychology. Leda Cosmides and John Tooby, two of the most influential evolutionary psychologists, outlined 6 core tenets of evolutionary psychology in a 2005 paper. Tenet 1. Your brain's purpose is to analyze information from the environment like a computer would process information. The brain is a physical system, and its pathways to process information are fine-tuned through natural selection. Pathways refers to the connections between brain cells or neurons that allow messages to travel from one region of the nervous system to another. In other words, a pathway is a group of neurons working together to get something done, like moving your feet to walk or turning the page when you're reading. Neural pathways are essential to learning, but also to repeating behaviors you've already learned. When you do something you've never done before, you have no pathway for that specific behavior. As you engage in the behavior, neurons start to get together and pass the message. The pathway becomes stronger the more you repeat the behavior, and it becomes easier or more likely for you to do the behavior. All right, that's tenet 1. Tenet 2. Your behaviors are a response to the information your brain has gathered from both its internal and external environment. This suggests that understanding your behavior means understanding how you process information, as well as understanding your thought pathways or patterns. Tenet 3. The pathways your brain has created from gathering and processing information have been influenced over time by ancestral environments. These evolutionary thought processes have roots in 2 main goals: survival and reproduction. Tenet 4. Some evolutionary behaviors may hold no benefit in current environments, but since cognitive programming may come from your ancestors, it may still contribute to handling modern-day challenges. Tenet 5. The brain has many evolutionary pathways, each one intended to solve a particular problem your ancestors faced. The more diverse your pathways, the more challenges you're able to overcome. In other words, you may have pathways in your brain that have not been created by your behaviors, but come from the behaviors and experiences of your ancestors. Tenet 6. Each of your pre-programmed pathways allows your brain to categorize your individual experiences. You're able to compare, analyze, recognize patterns, and develop concepts based on the framework you've inherited. Interesting. An example. In an ancient community, empathy may have allowed for a greater understanding of others, contributing to stronger relationships and more cooperation to ensure everyone's well-being. As empathy continued to be a beneficial trait practiced by one generation and the next, it eventually made its way to you. Now, when you're faced with the choice of helping someone or turning away, your evolutionary inclination toward empathy may encourage you to put yourself in other people's shoes and help. Interesting. This is fascinating, actually. Excuse me. Examples of behaviors explained by evolutionary psychology. Fear of predators. If you're naturally wary of bears and wolves, it may be because your ancestors quickly learned the consequences of not avoiding these animals in the wild. Partner selection preferences. Reproduction and survival are interlinked. Back in the day, choosing a partner most likely meant picking someone who displayed specific behaviors and traits that protected and supported the survival of the community and offspring. Evolutionary psychology would say that your current partner selections may be influenced by the choices that your ancestor clan tended to repeat more often. Dislike of dishonesty. Why is dishonesty so distasteful? Maybe because trust was important in a primitive community where people had to rely on one another to survive. If someone can't trust you, they might be less likely to share with you or offer you social support. This is so interesting because the traits that are being described that are positive and have been handed down are antithetical to traits that certain people have in order to get ahead in like cutthroat business society in our culture. It's pretty interesting. Empathy and trust. Feeling anxious. Borden indicates that evolutionary psychology can account for certain negative emotions like anxiety. Quote, sometimes certain experiences passed down from generations and growing up in a certain culture can more greatly influence these genetic dispositions, she says. This is why some individuals may have higher levels of anxiety. End quote. An example of this may be growing up in a culture that has a long history of unpredictability or facing greater dangers. You may find you're naturally more anxious, wary, and reserved, even though you may not have experienced anything personally. Anxiety may have become a protective trait to face unpredictability. Mental health in evolutionary psychology. The goal of evolutionary psychology isn't to explain mental health conditions, but it can offer insight into why you might be more likely to develop certain challenges. As Borden explains, evolutionary psychology may make you naturally inclined to certain traits, like being reserved or anxious. These inclinations may influence your behaviors and thoughts, which in turn can make you more likely to develop certain symptoms. Dr. Michael J. McGrath, a licensed psychiatrist in Kailua Kona, Hawaii, says phobias are one of the best ways to explore the evolutionary perspective on mental health. Many phobias can be traced back to survival-oriented fears, he says. Quote, it is thoughtful that these phobias are influenced in part by evolution, he explains. For example, it is beneficial for humans to be afraid of spiders, as some are poisonous. With a phobia, however, the fear is quite extreme. Another example he gives is achulophobia, the intense fear of darkness. Quote, it would make sense from an evolutionary perspective for humans to fear darkness as we don't see as well at night. And that makes us more vulnerable to predators, end quote, says McGrath. All right. Interesting stuff. The controversy around evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a theory that at times has been the source of critique and debate in the scientific community. A 2010 paper from researchers at the University of Texas at Austin mentioned these primary concerns about the evolutionary perspective in psychology. It may be difficult to test, prove, or even accurately know what ancient human habits were and how they translate to modern behaviors. Next critique. Evolutionary psychology contradicts domain general rationality, which states that behaviors are the result of in-the-moment critical thinking. Next critique. Contrary to many modern theories, it implies that the mind is not a blank slate at birth that can be completely molded and shaped through personal experience. I don't know if I agree with that because I think possibly the thing of generational trauma may be a real thing. Next critique. Cultural phenomena such as a transfer of beliefs or ideals through generations are not well explained in the original framework of evolutionary psychology and require more research. Okay, fair enough. Let's recap. Evolutionary psychology looks at how the behavioral habits of your ancestors may influence your behavior. Just as the biological evolution theory suggests your physical and biological traits are a result of the challenges your ancestors faced, psychological evolution suggests cognitive traits that were key to survival were also passed down from generation to generation. Some questions remain about the application of the evolutionary perspective in psychology. That is hella interesting, isn't it? I think so. Wow. Survival of the fittest, psychologically speaking. The idea of things being passed down generation to generation. Interesting. Like it said in the critique, there needs to be more study on transfer of beliefs through generations. They don't talk about trauma, but transfer of trauma through generations. I mean, come on. It's fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. What do you guys think? TakeYourPillsPod@gmail.com. Do you think evolutionary psychology explains human behavior? I don't know. I'm loving that piece, though. All right, this next one is from Very Well Mind. They got some good stuff there for sure. And it's called New Research Uncovers Why We All See the World So Differently. Interesting. And it's by Kathy Casata. Let's check it out. Oh, some key takeaways. A new study gives insight to the area of the brain that plays a part in how we understand others' perspectives. All right. Researchers discuss naive realism, the assumption that your interpretation of people and events is accurate or true over others' interpretations. And experts share ways to understand others' views that can help maintain relationships. All right, that is good. That is certainly worthwhile to know, because I think it's so sad that people on, different sides of the cultural divide, so to speak, it's things that are outside of people's control are hurting people's friendships and breaking relationships, even within families. It makes me sad. Here we go. Everyone has their own opinions, views, and ideas about life and the world around them. But why is it often hard to understand and accept others' take on the same matters? New research by UCLA psychology professor Matthew Lieberman, PhD, sheds light on an explanation by pointing to a part of the brain he calls the Gestalt cortex that sits behind the ear and between the areas of the brain that process vision, sound, and touch. What does the research say? In his research, which was based on an analysis of more than 400 studies and published in the journal Psychological Review, Lieberman explains that the Gestalt cortex helps people make sense of information that is ambiguous or incomplete, as well as dismiss alternative interpretations. Lieberman also discusses naive realism, which is the notion that people think their interpretation of people and events is accurate or true over others' interpretation. This can lead to beliefs that other people got it wrong. Lieberman claims naive realism may be the biggest driver of conflict and distrust between people. While social psychology has analyzed how people make sense of the world, explanation of parts of the brain that play a part hasn't been revealed. Although Lieberman states in his research that the Gestalt cortex isn't alone in helping people process what they see, he claims it is an essential component. For instance, he says the Gestalt cortex includes the temporoparietal junction, which he believes is linked to conscious experience and making sense of situations that people witness or encounter. Natalie Christine DiTillo, PhD, clinical psychologist and wellness expert, says this notion resonates with her. She explains that the term Gestalt means the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But practically speaking, she says, it refers to a person's adaptive capacity to construct their own reality, and is the way a person makes sense of things in face of incomplete or ambiguous information. Quote, most of the time we fill the gaps with our own biases, assumptions, beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and conclusions, says Natalie Kristen DiTilio. Because most situations, especially social situations, are filled with incomplete or unclear information, i.e. what another person might be thinking or feeling, she says people fill in the gaps with their own interpretations. That quote again, most of the time we fill the gaps with our own biases, assumptions, beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and conclusions, says DiTilio. Quote, this is especially relevant and problematic for individuals prone to anxiety or depression because the tendency would be to fill those gaps with negative, overly personal, catastrophic, or worrisome thoughts and conclusions. Interesting. How the research was done. Subjective construals are personal understandings of situations and the people and objects within them. Lieberman's review presents a model of subjective construals that are processed without a lot of effort. He calls these coherent, effortless experiences, CEE. 3 distinct forms of seeing, visual, semantic, and psychological, are discussed to highlight the breadth of these construals. The review states that the core CEE, coherent effortless experiences, characteristics are accumulated in the lateral posterior parietal cortex, lateral posterior temporal cortex, and ventral temporal cortex, which are collectively called the Gestalt cortex. The link between subjective construals and Gestalt cortex is backed by evidence showing that when people have similar subjective construals, meaning they see things similarly, they show greater neural synchrony with each other in the Gestalt cortex. The researchers conclude that, quote, the fact that the act of CEE-ing tends to inhibit alternative construals is discussed as one of the multiple reasons for why we fail to appreciate the idiosyncratic nature of our pre-reflective construals, leading to naive realism and other conflict-inducing outcomes, end quote. Wow, that is really hard to follow and understand. But I kind of get it. Do you guys kind of get it? Should I read it again? Would that even help? The researchers conclude that, quote, the fact that the act of CEE-ing, meaning CE stands for coherent effortless experiences. So the fact that the act of having coherent effortless experiences tends to inhibit alternative construals is discussed as one of multiple reasons for why we fail to appreciate the idiosyncratic nature of our pre-reflective construals, leading to naive realism and other conflict-inducing outcomes. Nope. Not wrapping my head around it completely. Here we go. This may illuminate things. How to accept others' perspectives. Understanding areas of the brain that contribute to how we see the world is fascinating. Yet finding ways to better accept others' perspectives may help you navigate social interactions day to day. Experts offer the following tips. Know you're wired to fill in gaps with biases. This is good to know. DiTilio says there are primal reasons for this. Quote, our brains evolved to sacrifice accuracy for the sake of efficiency because our survival depended on our ability to think quickly rather than think correctly in the face of a potentially life-threatening situation, she says. However, in modern times, she says people are more likely to experience a, quote, socially threatening situation, especially in a heightened state of stress and discord. Quote, this means that we are at least as likely to be wrong in our thinking about others as we are right, she says, adding that willingness to be wrong for the sake of growth and learning is a valuable mood management skill and promotes greater tolerance for different points of view. Realize it's okay to change your mind. If you've held a fairly firm view on a topic and publicly shared it, it can be difficult to express an alternative or opposing view without fear of being seen as wishy-washy or worse, says Datillo. However, quote, in actuality, being open and willing to change your mind is considered a sign of emotional intelligence and wisdom, she says. Yes. Acknowledge others may be right. While it's hard to think you're wrong, Julian Lagoy, MD, psychiatrist at MindPath Health, suggests being open to the fact that in some instances, others' opinions might be better or closer to the truth than your own. Quote, we need to always be willing to listen and have some understanding of other people's perspectives, even if we think they are incorrect, he says. Learn both sides of the argument. Learning both sides of an argument well, especially the side you disagree with, is one way to gain perspective, says Lagoy. He points to the famous philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas, who would always learn and understand the opposite point of view so well that he could explain it even better than those who believe that view, even though he disagreed with it. Chloe Carmichael, PhD, licensed clinical psychologist and author of Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety, agrees and suggests that learning three things about the other point of view and not considering them a danger. Quote, sometimes people can be afraid that if they learn about an opposing view, they'll get sucked into that point of view and I'll abandon my own view. But the truth is, learning about that argument on the other side can help us be more grounded and have firmer feet in why we have the view that we do, she explains. Enhance your listening skills. Listening during times when difficult topics are being discussed involves regulating your emotions, being non-defensive and compassionate, explains Datillo. She suggests practicing mindful listening, which is being fully present during conversations and reserving judgment. Quote, try listening to understand, not fix. Most of us are only half listening or hearing what we want to hear or thinking about what we want to say in response or what advice to give. This is not true listening, says Datillo. Quote, sometimes people can be afraid that if they learn an opposing view, they'll get sucked into that point of view. But the truth is, learning about the arguments on the other side can help us to be more grounded and have firmer feet in why we have the view that we do. That's that quote again by Chloe Carmichael, PhD. True listening is an active process of asking questions for clarification or to express interest, being curious, trying to learn something new, or trying to understand someone else's perspective or reasoning. Quote, this helps build both emotional and cognitive empathy, she says. Carmichael says to try to ask the person a few questions in order to demonstrate curiosity and willingness to listen and learn about their viewpoint. Then repeat back what they said so they know you are trying to understand them. Focus on just the facts. Quote, just the facts, end quote, is a technique therapists use in therapy to help clients minimize putting a spin on situations, especially in the face of incomplete or ambiguous information. To practice it for a given situation that is upsetting, Datillo suggests writing down the details and what you believe to be the cause of your distress. Then cross out each detail that contains an opinion, either negative or positive. Quote, this could also include statements that place blame on another person or yourself, or exaggerated terms like always, never, everything, or everyone, she says. Next, restate the explanations using only facts. Quote, ask yourself, if there were 100 people here, what could we all agree on, says Datillo. You'll quickly realize how readily we insert our opinions, biases, and judgments into everyday situations and conversations. Think of things you have in common. If you find yourself angry about someone's point of view or getting over-focused on your differences, Carmichael says to take a deep breath and think about a few things you really like about the person and any bonding features you share. Quote, it could be, Wow, we sure do differ on politics, but I do enjoy talking about my romantic life or catching up on dating. Or, it's so nice that this person is a good neighbor to me and we watch each other's kids or help each other out, she says. What this means for you. While having your own opinions of the world is natural, a new study explains how an area of the brain plays a part. Finding ways to understand others' views can help maintain relationships. Interesting piece, man. The Gestalt cortex, what was it called? The Gestalt pathway is the part of the brain that determines how well you deal with your own biases in conversation. Whoa. I'm trying to find what he's called. The Gestalt cortex, man. Fascinating. That was a cool piece. For sure. All right. And it is, I mean, come on, man. Life's too short to allow politics to rip two people apart. Especially when you have a media that is purposefully every day pushing out antithetical narratives about the same topic to get people to turn on each other by pulling at their emotions, by playing them like a fiddle. That shit's so sad. The powers to be want us to be separated. They want to divide and conquer us, and they're so good at it. We don't need that shit. All right, let's keep going. So, borderline personality disorder, I find that to be such an interesting diagnosis because there's still so much stigma surrounding it. It's a challenging diagnosis to have. It's challenging to get help for it. The therapy is difficult. There's no medication for it. There is a dialectic behavioral therapist. I have a good friend who has borderline personality disorder. She is proactive about taking care of it. She's doing well. Episode 10 and 11 of Take Your Pill Psychopath, part 1 and part 2, about my friend Jen Tisdale talking about borderline personality disorder in depth in a very, very vulnerable and funny way. You should check those episodes out. Some of the most popular episodes of the podcast. But this is a piece entitled, "Is It Finally Time to Eliminate the Borderline Diagnosis?" New study on borderline personality disorder suggests it's a flawed diagnosis. Interesting. And this is by Susan Krauss Whitborn, PhD, and it's in Psychology Today. Let's give it a read, shall we? Let's see what we got here. Some key points. Borderline personality disorder remains one of the most fascinating but most poorly understood diagnoses. The newest research takes a hard look at whether it's finally time to eliminate the borderline personality disorder diagnosis. Knowing that people are more than their diagnoses can help you think more realistically about this troubling set of qualities. For the past decade, mental health professionals have debated whether personality disorders fall into categories or dimensions. Rather than being an obscure academic controversy, this debate has practical ramifications for the mental health of millions of people around the world. On the one hand, having a diagnosis on the books can benefit patients who need documentation for insurance purposes. The contrary view is that categorical diagnoses artificially place mental health conditions into bins based on what are in reality variations along dimensional scales. In this ongoing dialogue, no personality disorder has received more attention than borderline personality disorder, BPD. The term borderline is often used in a pejorative sense to refer to people who may seem overly clingy and unstable, lacking boundaries between themselves and others. You may know someone who you or others refer to in this fashion, generally in a negative light. The question is whether it's justified to draw a circle around an individual's entire personality, provide a label, and leave it at that. A global view of borderline personality disorder. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, used in the US and Canada, retained what researchers maintained was an inaccurate and antiquated system of personality disorder classification based on categories. Interesting. Prior to the publication of the DSM-5 in 2013, there was a widespread belief in the mental health community that categories would be scrapped in favor of a new dimensional classification system. This didn't happen, but a compromise of sorts was reached in that the DSM-5 contains what's known as an alternative DSM-5 model that contains personality dimensional ratings along with severity estimates. The researchers and clinicians involved in revising the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD-10, and its newest version, the ICD-11, decided to avoid this dual approach and instead adopted a system almost exactly like the alternative DSM-5 model. However, the key here is almost. Unable to leave the borderline personality disorder category in the rearview mirror, the ICD-11 authors created a, quote, borderline personality specifier based on the DSM-5 diagnosis. Well, this is interesting. According to Fernando Gutierrez of the Institute of Neuroscience Hospital Clinic Barcelona and colleagues 2022, this last-minute addition to the dimensional system could very well be misguided. Clinicians in favor of retaining the category maintain that there was a need for continuity with previous knowledge and treatment. Those opposed argue, in contrast, that the borderline construct is based on unsystematic observation and clinical tradition, and it does not emerge in the empirical literature which maps the organization of personality pathology, including that leading to the renewal of the ICD-11. Potentially a, quote, passport to heterogeneity, quoting from a previous study, the question is whether it holds up under close empirical scrutiny. What is this thing called borderline personality disorder? If there is such an entity deserving of the BPD diagnosis, the Spanish researchers believed they could discover it by administering a set of instruments based on the categorical diagnostic system, as well as others using dimensional ratings. Okay, I'm getting a little bit confused here, but I do see what's going on. Is that there's a lot of conflicting points of view on this, on whether to have this as a diagnosis, or how to diagnose it, or how to categorize it. All right, here we go. A major strength of this research was the fact that the sample, 1,799 adults, ranged from 16 to 76 years old, average 40 years old, and included a clinical sample of 324 outpatients with a variety of DSM-5 disorders. None of the clinical patients received a categorical personality disorder diagnosis. All participants completed a set of instruments based both on dimensions and categorical BPD systems. The dimensional measures tapped the 5 domains of the ICD-11 system. An additional measure asked participants to rate themselves on items measuring the severity or possible undesired consequences of each dimension, namely negativity, affectivity, losing one's temper, worrying and feeling hopeless, detachment, lacking friends, avoiding people, dissociality, distrusting others and being callous, impulsiveness, and anancastia, or being overly organized. Another scale specifically measured the ICD-11's borderline pattern specifier, the borderline pattern scale, the BPS. Yeah, I'm totally confused. But here we go. The empirical question became determining. Okay, this will help illuminate things. The empirical question became determining whether the borderline pattern scale would stand on its own as a separate entity from the dimensional scale measures. If so, this would justify retaining the specifier in the ICD-11. Okay. The findings show that although the BPS retained its own inner consistency, as the authors concluded, quote, it adds nothing to the prediction of severity when the other domains are considered, end quote. Thus, the original 5 domains seem to do a reasonably good job on their own as indicators of an individual's position along a personality disorder continuum. Most importantly, however, scores on the BPS overlapped almost entirely with the items tapping into negative affectivity. Indeed, after making the necessary statistical adjustments, the correlation between the severity index and BPS scores was a remarkable 0.87 out of a maximum of 1.00. Even so, the authors note that there was a place for specification of BPD, but only as a, quote, particularly intense expression of negative affectivity, end quote. Despite this proviso, the authors were highly critical of the ICD-11 based on their data for including the BPS specifier. Quote, at worst, it will complicate diagnosis, produce ambiguous research, and lead to a misunderstanding of what borderline is, end quote. Okay, how to rethink your understanding of BPD. Maybe this is going to illuminate things. In common speech and the media, the term borderline will undoubtedly retain its popularity. There will invariably continue to be jokes about BPD, as well as fictional characterizations of main figures in literature and drama. Given its widespread usage, you'll perhaps find yourself slipping into the labeling of people who seem to intrude on your own boundaries or act in puzzling, impulsive ways. The Gutierrez, etc. findings show considerable doubt onto the existence of this unique condition as distinct from its components of particularly intense negative affectivity. When you think about what makes a person borderline, indeed, it may be this quality to which you respond. Reading down the list of the ICD-11 domains, the ones next highest in line in relationship to BPS were disinhibition and detachment. This finding would suggest that it's not even a simple domain that captures all the complexity of BPD. To sum up, thank goodness, once someone invents a category label, it can be difficult to think of people's psychological disorders in any way other than through the lens of an all or nothing entity. This more nuanced approach to understanding people based on their underlying qualities rather than as their outward name can have implications that stretch beyond diagnosis and into fulfillment in daily life. Yes, that's very well put, and I understand that, and it seems to make sense. You can't just lump somebody into a label and then try to make all of the pieces of their mental illness fit into it after the fact. To sum up, I'll read this again because it resonates and makes sense. Once someone invents a category label, it can be difficult to think of people's psychological disorders in any way other than through the lens of an all or nothing entity. This more nuanced approach that the DSM-5 decided essentially not to take, and that the ICD-10 did in part, or the ICD-11 did in part, decided to take, but not completely. This more nuanced approach to understanding people based on their underlying qualities rather than as their outward name can have implications that stretch beyond diagnosis and into fulfillment in daily life. Yep. Seems worthwhile to me. Man, we got interesting stuff this week, don't we? Huh? Are you guys enjoying this? I hope so. I am. I'm learning a lot. Okay, we got one more piece that we're going to do. Cool. This next piece is from a publication called PsyPost. PSY Post. PsyPost. And it's entitled Laughter with Friends Differs from Laughter with Romantic Partners, Study Finds. And it's by someone named Main Kara Yakubian. So let's see what we got here. can we differentiate laughter directed toward friends from laughter directed toward romantic partners? Interesting. A series of 3 studies published in Journal of Nonverbal Behavior suggests yes, finding that friendship laughter was deemed more natural and less vulnerable than romantic laughter. Okay, I'm interested. How is this possibly measured? Let's see. In humans, the ability to laugh emerges as early as 4 months of age, with laughter being the most recognizable expression of positive emotion across cultures. Laughter, a means of communicating social information, e.g., harmless intentions, is not unique to humans, however, suggesting it dates back to a shared ancestor. But along the way, humans also evolved complex speech, allowing for the use of laughter in various contexts. Selection must have favored those who could intentionally produce laughter, but also those who were able to recognize and decipher this fake laughter. Sally D. Farley and colleagues write, quote, "There is likely a dual pathway model for laughter production that distinguishes between spontaneous, meaning authentic, and volitional, meaning manipulated laughter. Laughter can signal one's affiliation as well as encourage and maintain positive relationships. In this work, Farley's team examined the ability to differentiate laughter directed toward 2 groups high in affiliation, friends and romantic partners. Okay, this is so interesting. Laughter stimuli was collected from Laughter stimuli was collected from archived 5-minute phone calls involving 27 individuals who called their romantic partner and a close same-sex friend. Okay. So from the 54 calls, because 27 times 2, from the 54 calls, laughter segments were clipped, yielding a total of 52 laughter segments after omitting 2 calls that had no laughter. Study 1 recruited 50 students from the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States who rated the 52 segments on a scale of 1, meaning extremely unpleasant, to 9, meaning extremely pleasant. They listened to each laugh a second time in randomized order and indicated whether they believed the laughter was directed toward a friend or a romantic partner. Participants had a better than chance accuracy for differentiating laughter between these 2 groups. As well, laughter directed toward romantic partners versus friends was rated as less pleasant sounding. Rates of accuracy did not differ for friend and romantic laughter. Further, men and women had similar rates of accuracy. This is surprising, given women are more sensitive to nonverbal cues and tend to outperform men in these judgments. The 2 most accurately identified laughs for all laughter types, i.e. female/male friend and female/male romantic partner, were selected as examples of prototypical laughs for a total of 8 laugh segments. A total of 58 participants provided 9-point ratings for the dimensions of spontaneity, e.g., what the fuck, dudes? Trying to understand this one. E.g., relaxed/tense, changing/monotone, and vulnerability, e.g., warm/cold, submissive/dominant. Okay? Given the scales for each dimension were not highly correlated, the researchers analyzed them separately. Laughter directed toward friends versus romantic partners was rated as louder, more masculine, dominant, slightly more mature sounding, and less breathy. Male laughter was perceived as more masculine and colder, while female laughter was perceived as louder, more natural, changing, mature, relaxed, and dominant. Holy shit. Study 3 utilized 12 laugh segments, 3 per condition, from a prior Farley study. These clips were different from those used in Study 2. A total of 252 individuals, 125 men, recruited on the online crowdsourcing platform Prolific, participated in this research. They listened to the 12 laugh segments one at a time and in random order, providing ratings on a 9-point scale, ranging soft/loud, cold/warm, natural/forced, not breathy/breathy, submissive/dominant, relaxed/tense, masculine/feminine, and monotone/changing. Laughter audio could be played numerous times, but participants could not go back to the previous page to change a rating. Once again, participants had a better than chance accuracy in differentiating friendship laughter from romantic laughter. As well, there was greater accuracy for friendship versus romantic samples. While there were no differences between men and women in identifying friendship laughter, women had higher accuracy for identifying romantic laughter. Laughter with friends was rated as louder, warmer, more changing, natural, relaxed, breathy, and dominant compared to laughter with romantic partners. Male laughter was perceived as more masculine, relaxed, and natural sounding, while female laughter was rated as louder, warmer, and more changing. These studies provided some support for the researchers' vulnerable love hypothesis, which predicted that laughter directed toward romantic partners would sound more vulnerable, e.g. submissive and warm, revealing, quote, the vulnerable relationship status of early stage romantic love, end quote. Farley and colleagues write, quote, future studies should consider the variety of acoustic features of laughter, such as pitch, perhaps even through artificial manipulation, to see how they affect different percepts of laughter within romantic and non-romantic contexts, end quote. Interesting. We got through that study. Sort of a bit hard to understand on the page how they did the study, but apparently there is a more natural, free-flowing type of laughter amongst friends than romantic partners. I don't know. I know in previous relationships, I like to think that I've made my significant others laugh equally to how I've made my friends laugh, if not more so. Who knows? I don't know. Hard to know. Maybe. Quote, future studies should consider the variety of acoustic features of laughter. Yeah. The vulnerable love hypothesis, which predicted that laughter directed toward romantic partners would sound more vulnerable. Who knows? Interesting. Glad we read that. Glad we did that. All right, we're at a good time for this particular episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I know I've plugged the email throughout the pod. I'd love to hear from you guys. Build a sense of community here. So shoot me an email. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what you're going through. Let me know how your mental health is lately. It's takeyourpillspod@gmail.com. Also, I lovingly implore you to join the Patreon if you're enjoying this and find value in this work. Patreon.com/jfod. Get a free episode, exclusive bonus episode every week. And it helps me out. jfodnews.com is the newsletter. Do the free version there. And this has been another episode of Take Your Pills, Psychopath, the comedy podcast that exploits mental illness for personal profit. What? Trademark. I've been your host, John F. O'Donnell. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thanks for listening. I love you guys. Bye.